Welcome back to our podcast. We have Mark, President of Volunteer Matters, and I'm Sophia, Success Coach with Volunteer Matters. Today's topic is when to background check volunteers. And so we're going to start off with 3 things to consider when deciding who to background check.
Yeah, so do we background check at all? Is it necessary? I think, what percentage of our customers would you say background check their volunteers, or at least some of their volunteers?
Over 90 or 80,
Yeah.
80 to 90%, yeah.
Yeah. So this is becoming, well, actually, let me do a little bit of a history thing here, which is kind of, I don't know, it's interesting to me. Maybe other people find it interesting. But it used to be that background checking was really prohibitively expensive and difficult to do. And so when we first started Volunteer Matters 20 years ago, it was actually a much lower percentage of our organizations did a background check. They might have done things like done reference checks or interviews or things like that more so. But what has happened is that it's become easier and more affordable and more streamlined and more efficient than ever to go and find out if anybody has had a bad history. And so what's happened there is that from a liability perspective, it's become more of an expectation out there within the court systems to say, well, when is an organization being responsible versus irresponsible when it comes to who they're bringing in their organization? So just as an example, if it cost $1,000 to background check a volunteer, and somebody took you to court and said, hey, you had this bad actor in your group that you brought in and it wreaked this havoc and it caused this damage either to somebody's person or physical body or whatever, they would look at that and say, well, we can't expect everybody to background check every volunteer. It costs $1,000 a pop. No nonprofit would be able to do this. Well, and not only that, but it was hard to, you actually had to go into police departments or whatever else. Now, in today's day and age, you can go online, you can sign up for a service, and within minutes, you can be running a background check for $20, right? So now what happens is if you're in a situation from a liability perspective, they look at it and go, what were you thinking not background checking a volunteer? That's just irresponsible behavior. The other language that you'll often see within the law is what's reasonable and customary. And so you'll see things in there where this is perfectly reasonable that you should have been doing this. It would have been like saying, well, the guy was carrying a sword when he walked into your facility. Any reasonable person would say you shouldn't let him in, right? So that's the sort of stuff we're dealing with from a liability perspective. But from the other side of it, it's just a matter of we want our programs to be safe and we want them to be effective and we want to bring the right people in. And so outside of the liability perspective, we don't want anybody getting hurt in the first place. So we just have to make sure that we have good people there. So Sophia talked about the 3 things to consider. I'll kick it off, and I'll say that one of the things that you should consider is what tasks are the volunteer actually performing. Does this require a background check based on the work that they're actually doing? Does this work introduce any risk or liability that would need a background check? And so I can give you a one that sometimes people will go, I don't know that they need a background check, but what if there was a volunteer that was actually collecting money? Let's say that they're actually accepting donations. They're working at a counter accepting money at an auction or something like that. They're registering people or they're taking cash in to attend a fundraising event, a carnival or something like that. They're working the food and beverage, stand at a sporting event or something like that. Do we have to background check those people? And you go, well, based on the work that they're doing, what's the answer to that question? And this is really for you guys to decide. But sometimes it makes sense to say, yeah, let's background check anybody handling money. That's like a good one. Have they ever embezzled? Have they ever stolen? And then we can decide whether or not we want them in that position or not. And sometimes the tasks they're performing, that there may be a legal requirement to background check them based on the type of work that they're doing. So I'll start with that one. You obviously have to evaluate what kind of work they're doing and does that lend itself to a background check?
say that the next thing is who is a volunteer working with, what population. So children, elderly, they're both very at-risk populations. Other at-risk populations, I don't know. They're probably
people with mental disabilities, right?
Yeah. So you got to make sure that everyone's well equipped, whoever's working with that group.
Yeah, anybody who's vulnerable, and if they're working with them, you should be background checking them. I feel this is like something I feel like extremely passionate about, because I actually know how easy it is to put systems in place to make sure people are background checked and that they've passed their background checks. And here's the other thing to as far as like what groups they're working with. If you have volunteers that are working with children in almost any capacity, there is no excuse for not background checking people. You absolutely should be doing it. And I told this story on a previous episode, but I think it's an important one to say. Is sometimes we take things for granted that everybody out there in the world is a good actor, and that they come into a nonprofit organization because they're a really good person, right? They came to us, we're a church group, or we help disadvantaged children. Like, these are good people. They're donating their time to come out here and help them. I'm not going to background check them. And what you find out, unfortunately, in our world is that predators and bad actors, they actually seek out environments where there is an at-risk population. That's actually what they gravitate to in order to victimize someone. So, sometimes it's just an honest, this isn't a good match. I know you would like to volunteer here, and I'm sure you're a good person now, but there are things in your past where we just can't from a liability perspective. But on the other part of it, like if you have an organization that works with kids, it will attract people who abuse kids. If you have a population that works with the elderly, like we have nonprofit groups where they'll go in and they perform services to help people go out shopping and things like that, it will attract people that want to take advantage of that population. That's just the reality. Unfortunately, we don't like to think about that, but it's a reality. So if they work with any at-risk population, you absolutely should be doing that.
It's and it's like something like 99% of volunteer background checks come back all clear, but really like that 1%, it's super important to catch. You don't want that slipping through. So
yeah. We work with a background check provider, Sterling Volunteers. They've been a great partner of ours for years, and they do a lot of great studies and provide us with good metrics. One of the things they came back with is that it's over 90% of the background checks that they run on volunteers come back without any criminal history convictions whatsoever. So that's fantastic. It's fantastic for two reasons. One is we know 90% of the people out there are at plus, are good actors, and they are doing it for all of the right reasons. And two is that the administrative burden to background checking somebody just became super, super easy, because we only have to focus on 10% of the people. So like as an example, in our system, if the background check comes back from Sterling, let's say, with no criminal history whatsoever, we mark them as approved. And like nobody needs to even look at that. So it just gets run, everything is perfectly automated, and in 90% of the cases, there's no administrative overhead to doing that. In the 10%, and where, Sophia, you're getting that 99% number, is out of the remaining 10% or less, it's only 9 out of that 10%, or it's 9 out of that 10%. Whatever it is that came back on their background check did not preclude them from volunteering. So in our customer base, it's only 1% of volunteers in total that are precluded from volunteering because of something that came back on a background check. So the group who the volunteer works with, super, super important. That's the major driving factor in addition to the tasks that they perform. And then what's the third, Sophia?
The last one is the level of autonomy of the volunteer. Right. So are they being supervised all the time by a staff person? Or are they going to be alone at all while they're working? Who are they going to be alone with? That goes back, like all three pieces overlap. So, you have to take into each one into consideration. But the last one is, are they alone? What kind of supervision do they have?
So it's like a Venn diagram. of these three overlapping elements. So right in the center of that, to say, should I background check, would be somebody that's performing a task that would necessitate a background check, working with a population that would necessitate a background check, and that they're given some level of autonomy where they're doing these things independently. And then where it gets a little bit more gray is when you go, okay, well, what if it's only one of these things, right? Then you might go, well, okay, if it's only one of them, they don't have to do a background check. Like, let's say, for example, that they're able to do their volunteering entirely on their own, but they're not doing it with any at-risk population, and the type of work that they're doing doesn't really put the organization at risk, even if they were an axe murderer, right?
Wow.
So I know I tend to go a bit extreme in my examples, but some of these things, like, this is, and again, this is up to you to decide, but let's say that you had a volunteer that was doing a task, like, let's say, and this is the example I was alluding to before that I used in a previous episode, was a children's museum. And they were basically guiding children through a museum and telling them about the different displays. Now, that task doesn't really necessarily scream, I need a background check in order to talk through some of the museum displays. And then you say, okay, well, what's the group that the volunteer works with? And that screams, okay, this may be something, right, that you have to get a background check for because they're working with kids. And then you take into account the last one, which is the level of autonomy. And I said, well, what if it was just that the volunteers were helpers to a paid staff person? And that paid staff person was the one who was actually the guide, and they were there, and all of the kids were always within their line of sight, and the volunteers were never alone with them, like they were always supervised. Then I might look at that and go, okay, we're back to maybe they don't require a volunteer, a background check. And the example that I used in the previous episode was a children's museum. And but then the question I asked them at the end was, well, so they're never alone? They go, no, they're always supervised. So I said, well, so the volunteer never would take a child to the bathroom, for example. And they're like, oh no, that's like a major thing that they do. Like they're like one of the main reasons why they're there is so that the lead, who's the staff person, can continue with the tour while the volunteers take the kids to the bathroom. And immediately I go, now you just checked off two of the boxes saying that they should have it. They're alone with kids and they're with kids. So in that case, that advocation would be you should absolutely be background checking them. So when you also have to think, what's that?
One more. I feel like another example would be fun to go through. I think it helps conceptualize all these things. But I think of like an event volunteer. Maybe it's a 5K, right? And there are kids there, but it's they're always supervised. They're never alone with kids. And then maybe they're just doing like a water stand or something at the 5K. Oftentimes, like they don't need to be background checked. So that's just another example I think is helpful.
Yeah, perfectly. So if we don't, I've also had organizations that say we're background checking everybody no matter what. That's not a good thing either. Like you're super safe, but now you're taking things too far and it becomes a burden on the volunteer when it's not necessary. So that's why we sort of take these three things all the time and think about it very carefully. So somebody who's working a water station at a 5K fundraiser, I don't think needs to be background checked. But again, that's, for somebody else to decide. But we have some organizations that say, listen, if you volunteer for us, we run a background check, that's that. Obviously, That's their prerogative, but it becomes a cost issue. And it becomes, are we driving volunteers away that would normally, have happily volunteered, and now we're requiring background checks to do that. But I will say that if background checks had zero cost, I would just background check everybody. So because there are ways in which you can make it super easy on the volunteer and it's not that much of a burden. And if they got scared away by it, they probably, shouldn't volunteer for you anyway. But the cost factor is one of them. All right. So once we decide that a background check is required, then we have some other things to think about surrounding that, like What type of background check is needed? What are some of the policies surrounding it? So why don't we start with the more operational side of things, and then I'll talk a little bit about the different types of background checks. But Sophia, can you talk a little bit about what kind of policies we might want to have once we decide that we are going to background check at least some of our volunteers?
Yeah, oftentimes I see organizations having background checks being done every year or every 2 years, maybe even longer than that. Those are just the two most common durations, but so you have to decide when is it going to be repeated. And then, yeah, again, the age exemption piece too, like are you background checking minors?
Yep. So on whether or not they need to be repeated, again, this is something for your organization to decide, and conferring with your insurance provider, your HR department, your legal representation. Background checks are obviously only looking at things where somebody got caught and it happened in the past. And it sometimes doesn't include things that somebody is in the process of getting convicted of right now. So there are background check providers, Sterling Volunteers being one of them, that they actually recheck. So in our system, if you background check a volunteer today, for a year, they refresh the background check, and then they'll let us know if something popped over a year afterward. So we typically recommend, if it requires a background check, you should recheck them every year. And in other cases, it's acceptable to be every 2 years, sometimes every 3 years. But once it gets to be older than 3 years, you never know what has happened since, right? So there are some times where we'll have organizations that only background check at the time they first volunteer. And I typically kind of, cringe at that policy. If you require a background check and it's only looking backward, then at some point we need to check again. So that's something for you to consider. Age exemptions too. So, are there do we background check minors? If their records are sealed, why are we background checking them? If there is anything, why are we taking on that additional cost if nothing's going to come back on their background check anyway? And then obviously what the approval process is. Like that needs to be clearly communicated internally to say, okay, well, when a volunteer, what's the process? How does the volunteer submit to that background check? How do we run it? Who's responsible for looking at the results? Who actually has the authority to see background check results and the expertise to determine whether or not if something came back that allows them to be eligible or ineligible for that volunteer activity. So those are all things that need to be considered, documented. And again, from a privacy standpoint and from just a best practices standpoint, you have to be careful about who has access to this data and information because it is very highly sensitive. So usually it's somebody within an HR capacity that may do this for employees, and they also are responsible for this aspect of volunteer onboarding as well. So let's talk about the different types of background checks. So sometimes I'll get people who will say to me, well, I see this background check provider and they charge $5 for a background check. And this other one charges $25. And so, it's a background check is a background check. So I'm going to go with the $5 guy. I could do an hour on this, but I'll just say, here's a good rule of thumb. You get what you pay for. And so when you pay for a $5 check, you're going to get a less accurate check. When you pay for a $25 check, you're going to get a more accurate check. And what determines the accuracy? A $5 check more than likely is going to go to a national database. It's just a database that they've been collecting of stuff. Whereas a $25 check, they'll actually go and check specific county records that the volunteer has either lived or worked or sometimes had an arrest in, and they'll actually go to county courthouses and check to see if there's anything there right now. Not some database where somebody has been aggregating results, and it might not get refreshed for every 3 months. It might have entire districts or counties that aren't included in the database. So that's just something to be a little bit focused on. The other thing is the difference between getting a background check from your local police department versus your state. You can go directly to your state and have them run a background check, versus a national background check provider versus a federal background check. So I'll just step through those real quick. Police department usually is running a state check on your volunteer. Depending on your state, they may only be checking for convictions, crimes within your state. That means that, like, we live in a very transient state here in Florida. People are coming in and out all the time. If I ran a state check here, it's only going to include crimes they were convicted of in the state of Florida. And it won't check the fact that this person moved from out of state a year ago and they, committed a slew of crimes before moving here. So that's something to consider. Obviously, same thing with the state checks. If you go to the state and run a check through their systems. A national background check provider, in my opinion, is the best type of check because they're actually checking everywhere that the volunteer has lived or ever, had an arrest and they'll check all of those counties directly. So they're actually going down to the county level. So if I ran that here in Florida, I'm going to get it if I lived here, if I lived in Texas, if I lived in California, if I lived in New York, they're going to find that and find any arrests and convictions there as well. The one benefit to the state level check is that they go back forever. Or for as long as they contain those records. So you might find something on there where they were convicted of something 10 years ago, whereas the national searches can only go back 7 years. So that is a plus to the state level check. And then lastly is the fingerprinting. So the fingerprint checks most typically are the FBI fingerprint checks. And sometimes people see this as the gold standard. They're like, if you're getting fingerprinted, that's obviously the best background check to have. And my answer to that is not necessarily. So this is some things people don't typically know about fingerprinting volunteers. Yeah, it's awesome we have their fingerprints. Now, if they commit a crime, we can dust, our nonprofit organization to see who is actually there. But what they're actually doing is they're checking the federal database, their fingerprints against the federal database. And there are entire regions of the country that are not legally required to report into the FBI database. This is something people don't know. So this is just what they have on record at the federal level. For example, I think it's like a third of the counties in the state of California don't report in to the FBI database. That's just California. So sometimes people think they're doing the absolute best thing by getting them fingerprinted, but in actuality, they would find more if they ran a national background check from a provider. And that is because they're actually going down and checking every county records that where they have lived. And in some cases, even if they have had an arrest in that area, they'll check both of those things and see what convictions there were. So that's my 2 cents on that, the short version of the 1 hour thing. Yeah, go ahead, Sophia.
Yeah, well, do you want to end with, like, if you're looking to design a background check policy for your organization, who can help you do that?
That's a great thing to end on. So why don't you take it since you were already thinking about that?
So there are a few different places that you can get help. I'd say a very important place is legal representation within your organization. So someone in HR who has that professional experience can definitely guide you on who needs to background check. They often know those different laws and everything. Do you want to take another? Do you have one in mind?
Well, I'll tack on to that one is that sometimes our customers don't have a robust human resources department. Like we have some customers that have, a massive HR department. They've got thousands of employees. And so they have people who specialize in the legal requirements, HR requirements. If you don't have that type of person in your organization, then you may have some legal representation, like an actual law firm or somebody that does that for you. So that's something else that you may want to consider because, yeah, like I said, sometimes it's not, they don't have robust HR departments.
I didn't think about that.
The other one that I'll say is, and that people often overlook, is your insurer. And it's my 2 cents on insurance companies, because we work with a lot of them, is that your insurer should be helping you more than just providing you a policy. So they should be helping you to provide guidance on what policies you should have, what procedures you should have. If your insurance provider is not doing that for you, you should perhaps consider a new insurance provider. So we work with a number of them that are fantastic. Off the top of my head, Redwoods is a great insurer of nonprofits that does a great job with policies and procedures. Great American, Philadelphia insurers. So definitely, if you don't feel like you have that support, look for it in your insurance agency. And this is the reason why. Number one is they have a lot of experience and internal know-how in this area. But the other reason is that they don't want to have something where they have to pay out on a claim. So they typically have departments that are saying, hey, you should have this policy, you should be doing this, and you can't be doing that, because we don't want to have to go back and have a huge payout because you were doing something you shouldn't be doing, or you had a policy you shouldn't have, or you weren't implementing a policy you should have. So your insurer is a big one. So more than likely, your insurer has somebody within their group that can help you with policies and procedures. That's a good one to lean on. What else, Sophia?
You can also get a lot of help from governing bodies. So if you're part of an association, federation, there might be contractual obligations as part of your membership to that association, or they just might have a lot of experience and can help you out. But I think
so
with YMCA's,
go ahead.
I know they have a lot of standard policies that YMCA's all over the country follow, and some other organizations.
So they're a great organization. We have a lot of YMCA customers, and actually they've really helped us grow in this area just by giving us exposure and experience with their own policies and procedures. And for example, their national association has resources that will say, because they work with kids, they have national level resources that you can call and ask, and they'll provide you with guidelines, policies. They have the person that's responsible for this nationally is like top tier person. She's fantastic. And so they have like literally an office where you can call and say, well, what should we be doing? What should we be not doing? And they also have requirements. Same thing with Boys and Girls Clubs. They have a similar thing where nationally they say you need to be doing these things in order to maintain your charter with us. So like, if you're not doing this, you can't call yourself a YMCA, or you can't call yourself a Boys and Girls Club. It's like a condition. So that's a really great one, Sophia, that these national or federations or associations, sometimes it's just a professional association. Like I'm a part of the Association of Nonprofits for our state, and they may have statewide resources that you can contact, or they at least can put you in touch with other nonprofits, which sort of falls into, I think, the last category, which is you could just find organizations that are similar to yours. So if I, like as an example, if I were a YMCA and they didn't have the national office or mentor organizations, I could go talk to our city's Parks and Rec department and say, well, you guys have a lot of programs that are similar to ours. What do you guys do? I can go to another organization that provides daycare services or after-school programs and say, well, what do you guys do? What are your lawyers telling you? What are your insurers telling you? What are your associations and national organizations telling you? So if you don't have a governing body that isn't doing a good job of providing you with these resources, then just find other organizations that do what you do. One of the defining characteristics, so years and years ago, I used to work in Fortune 500 developing software for large corporations. And one of the defining differences between that space that I worked in all those years ago and nonprofits, where everybody loves to share in nonprofits. Like you want to be better at making the world a better place? Like, I'm here to help you. I want you to know the mistakes I made and the successes that I've had. And I'm happy to give you my time, energy, and attention to help you be better at what you're doing. Like even to go back to the YMCA movement, they have YMCAs that put on conferences each year. It's not even it's not put on by the national organizations, literally put on by YMCAs, where they get together and they just talk about risk management policies. They do an annual conference where they talk about risk and liability and everything from slip and fall stuff, like what do you do when you have a swimming pool, to how do you keep predators out of your YMCA? And so those are fantastic. And if you don't have those, find a like organization, and they will be happy to share with you. You just got to find the right person, and even that's usually pretty easy. You can call the main number and say, hey, who can I talk to, and they'll get you to the right person. So sometimes people hesitate to reach out for help, in many ways, but you definitely should, because nonprofits are here to help. Like literally, that's what they're here for. So, and they'll help your nonprofit too. So
Yeah, there's that cultural piece. Everyone, it's like an automatic in. Like, oh, you're a nonprofit, me too. Let's do this together.
it's
Kind of thing.
a beautiful part of working with nonprofits. So rewarding, right? Sophia, you worked in a couple of industries before coming over to the nonprofit space. I mean, how do you feel about that kind of mentality?
It's really amazing. It's one of my favorite parts of what I do is working with nonprofits. Like the people are generally very kind and big hearts, and it's a big difference from just being in, like you said, like a company. But
Yeah,
regular
very
business,
generous.
So.
Like
Yeah.
like it is, like that's the defining thing, is that it's generosity. So, that's just what makes our work so rewarding. So definitely take full advantage of that. All right, so I think that's a really good overview of when to check background check volunteers. Well, I guess we'll wrap this up, and we'll see you on the next podcast, right?
See you soon. Absolutely.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.